All right. Well, I'd like to welcome you all to our second GEMMS virtual lecture. I am Jennifer Fruch. I am a research associate and project manager for GEMMS. And in case anyone doesn't know, GEMMS is an online bibliographic database of early modern manuscript sermons. And so during this lecture series, we are featuring some of the latest research on manuscript sermons. And it is with great pleasure that I get to introduce you to Dr. Lucy Underwood. She'll appear as Lucy Healy on your screen because that's her married name. She is currently an honorary research fellow at Warwick University, and she received her PhD from the University of Cambridge. Her first book was Childhood, Youth, and Religious Dissent in Post-Reformation England, which was published in 2014. And she also is the editor of Volume 3 of the Bloomsbury Cultural History of Youth, which is coming out this year. And she also has published, among other things, English Preachers at the Papal Court. And you'll have to forgive my cat. And we're also lucky enough to have her working as a consultant on GEMMS, and she's been adding some data related to Catholic sermons from her own research, which will really expand the information we have on Catholic sermons in GEMMS, which is great. So I will then hand things over to you, Lucy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I think it is afternoon on both sides of the Atlantic, just about. And it's great to have the opportunity to give this lecture for GEMMS. So, preaching the Counter-Reformation in England. In July 1599, not for the first or last time, John Gerard was crouching in a hidden loft space, hoping the officers of the law searching the house below would not find him. Getting out of sight had been a more hurried operation than usual. The magistrates had already seen a portable altar and vestments set out ready to celebrate a Catholic mass. Gerard's servant and assistant had not been able to hide, and still spread on a table in his chamber were Gerard's papers. As he describes, my meditation notes, my breviary and several Catholic books, and, what I valued most, my manuscript sermons and notes for sermons, which I had collected together over the last 10 years. With self-sacrificing presence of mind, the servant claimed the books and papers as his own. Asked by the magistrates, "Are you a priest?" John Lilly replied, "I won't tell you whether I am a priest, it's for you to prove it, but I am a Catholic." This was pretty much as good as a yes, and Lilly was seized with the papers and hauled off to prison, where he had an unenviable time, particularly after it became clear that he was not, in fact, John Gerard, the Jesuit priest, but had been covering for him. But what about the sermon notes? Annoyingly, they do not seem to have been preserved by the state, and the only thing we know about their contents is that John Gerard was not preaching rebellion, sedition, and tyrannicide from the pulpit, or Elizabethan London would have heard about it, as would readers of history books ever since. But we know they existed. We know that preaching was part of the mission of the priests who ministered clandestinely in Elizabethan and early Stuart England, and that the sermon texts they prepared were valuable enough to be kept with considerable difficulty, presumably for future reference and reuse. So this lecture will try to uncover a little more about English Catholic preaching, its context and content. In some ways, a clandestine sermon is an oxymoron. The pulpit was inherently a public space, the sermon a public proclamation. Should move on to the next slide. Catholic sermons in England took place in private spaces before a cautiously selected congregation, and a key aim of the event was not to become public. Yet preaching was as central to the Catholic Reformation as to Protestant reformers. The new religious orders of Catholic renewal poured great effort into effective preaching, and the great public preachers of the age drew large crowds to their sermons. Catholic Reformation preaching was central both to reviving or renewing the faith of Catholics and to what may properly be called Counter-Reformation, the reconversion of Protestants. English priests were formed in the culture of the Catholic Reformation. From 1568, they studied at colleges established in continental Europe to train Englishmen for the priesthood and thereby maintain Catholic congregations in Protestant England. They returned to England in the face of statutes that made their presence a capital crime, and for at least the first few decades of the mission, lethal persecution was very real. Under the circumstances, English preaching had to focus most on a Catholic audience whose faith must be sustained and revived, rather than on preaching campaigns targeting Protestants, such as were possible in, for example, parts of Germany or of the Holy Roman Empire. Yet, as will be seen, their hearers could include Protestants. As we know from studies of the curriculum at the English College in Douai, that in the first generation after its founding, there was a strong focus on subjects which would enable the students to refute Protestant doctrines, that is, on biblical languages, doctrinal controversy, and disputation. All this would feed very well not only into evangelizing Protestants if occasion arose, but preaching to Catholics who were continually exposed to Protestant culture and needed good reasons to resist the pressure to conform. We know from occasional references that preaching was an expected part of a priest's duties, although missionary reports seldom dwell on it specifically. During his missionary tour of the west and north of England in 1580 to 81, this is quite early in the mission, the Jesuit Edmund Campion wrote that, "On horseback I meditate my sermon, when I reach the house I polish it," indicating that preaching was routine wherever he went. In the Catholic Mass, a sermon expounding the day's scripture readings is usually preached after the Gospel reading and before the Eucharistic part of the liturgy. Campion's words suggest, however, that the sermon came after the Mass. Mane per acto sacro verba facio in Latin, or in Gerald Kilroy's translation, "In the morning I say Mass and then I preach." Perhaps this format, having the sermon take place after the Mass was ended, allowed for a longer sermon. And this is suggested, incidentally, by some details we have on the last sermon Campion ever preached, thanks to the report of the government agent who secretly turned up at this Mass and sermon and then later arrested him. So this sermon was preached at a gentleman's house in Berkshire, known as Lyford Manor. The congregation included the household and a number of local Catholics visiting for the occasion. According to the government agent, George Eliot, after Mass was finished, Campion seated himself in a chair at the front of the room and, quote, "made a sermon very nigh an hour long on the text that Christ wept over Jerusalem." This was from the Gospel reading for that week, the ninth Sunday after Pentecost. It's Luke chapter 19, 41 to 47. Campion gave the text a national topical interpretation by applying, according to Eliot, the same to this country of England, for that the Pope his authority and doctrine did not so flourish here as the said Campion desired. Campion compared the rejection of Christ by Jerusalem's leaders to England's rejection of Catholicism. We also have some information about other sermons. Campion, again, is reported to have preached on the feast of Saints Peter and Paul, two saints of central importance to Catholic theology, as the Pope's claim to authority is founded on his being the successor to St. Peter as Bishop of Rome. This was in June 1580, very shortly after Campion's arrival in London. The patronage of a nobleman probably enabled a relatively large audience to attend in the Great Hall of Lord Paget's London Palace. But sermons didn't only take place under, aristocratic patronage, of course. And I've said that the congregation would be carefully selected, which it probably would, but on occasion, non-Catholics might be admitted. So we have the account of another Jesuit, William Stanley, who was working in and around Winchester in Hampshire in the early 1590s. On one occasion, someone asked to bring a Protestant friend to see him, this acquaintance having promised that he would definitely not turn the priest in. So he's a Protestant, but he's promised that, he definitely wouldn't dob anyone in. And we know this chap, who this chap was. He's a young servant called Lawrence Humphreys. He later gets martyred. So that's just an indication that Stanley's ministry is happening among the lower gentry and the sort of upper middling sort in Hampshire. So it's not always aristocratic patronage. Anyway, so the 1585 statute, which made priests' presence in England treason, also made it a capital felony to harbour or assist a priest. Okay, so it's therefore worth noting that Stanley agrees to this and says, saying that in a few weeks I need to come into your parts to give the sacraments and have sermons among your neighbours, and on such a day in such a house, by God's grace, I am preacher. The priest duly came, heard confession, celebrated mass, and preached. And he writes, it was in the octave, the 8 days following the feast of Corpus Christi. And so, says Stanley, I spoke words on the truth of the presence of Christ's body in the most holy sacrament. Catholic sermons usually followed the liturgical calendar closely. And of course, in this one, he's speaking on a subject of great controversy between Catholics and Protestants. According to Stanley, there were 2 heretics present at the sermon, this one who was fervent in his religion, and another a little more moderate. After the sermon, I had conference with both of them, and through the grace of God, in a short time, I reconciled both of them to the Catholic faith. Sorry, I should have... where are we? There. Okay. And that's the Latin, and that's my translation of Stanley's account of this episode. Now, as I've said, one of these two was the 19-year-old Lawrence Humphreys, who not long after would be martyred for his Catholic faith. So these were Protestants who were open to changing their religion, but nevertheless, the example is a reminder that Catholic sermons, clandestine though they were, could be occasions for evangelization as well as for instructing the faithful. And as I said, Stanley is focusing on the presence of Christ in the Eucharist, a major point of contention between Catholics and Protestants. Moving on to another sort of scattered clue in our search for Catholic preaching practice. A generation later, in the 1620s, sermons seem to have been a regular feature of Catholic life in the capital. The Jesuit priest Robert Drury preached repeatedly at the French ambassador's residence, Hunsdon House, Blackfriars. So that's another sort of patronage that Catholics, certainly later in James I and Charles I's reigns, can rely on, which is, the protection of foreign ambassadors. We know about this because on the 26th of October, 1623, the floor of the upper room in which they were gathered collapsed, Drury and some of his congregation being killed. The 95 deaths caused by this accident prompted some exultant Protestant pamphlets dwelling on the providential judgment against wicked people who went to Catholic sermons. That slide seems to have inexplicably gone blank. Never mind. But what the Blackfriars tragedy tells us is that Catholic sermons were regular events, that they could be held outside of Mass. Drury was preaching during the evening prayer service of Vespers at the time of the accident. That, like other Catholic activity, they might be facilitated by foreign ambassadors whose houses offered a privileged space protected to some degree from pursuit. That secrecy dictated a discreet location within the house, the upper room, that nevertheless audiences might run to several dozen. There seem to have been 95 killed, and that wasn't everyone, so over 100. So basically, research on Catholic preaching practice in England at this time is still preliminary, but these clues give us some sense of preaching practice and its significance to dissenting Catholic communities. English Catholics did not only preach in England, however, they also preached in English Catholic institutions in exile, the seminaries where priests were trained for mission to England, the English convents and monasteries established in Flanders and France are the most obvious locations. At the Venerable English College, Rome, several dozen sermon texts survive, preserved in a manuscript volume still in the college archives. All of these sermons are in Latin. Some were preached in the college church for an audience that might comprise local visitors, some of them very high-ranking, as well as college students and staff. Some were preached in the refectory, in the dining room of the college, so for a more in-house audience. And some were preached before the Pope and his court in the papal chapel at the Vatican or Lateran palaces. And these sermons are some of my main material today. The context and audiences for these English Catholic sermons on the continent, preached on the continent, differed greatly from that of sermons at home on the mission. Yet there were also connections. Many of the preachers, certainly all those who were scholars of the English College Rome, expected to join the English mission after their studies. The repeated calls in reports back to Rome that missionaries should be good preachers suggests that part of the point of this preaching was to help train the seminarians in preaching skills. Although the Roman sermons are not in the vernacular, the skills would, I think, be transferable to some degree. The English college sermons very frequently turned their liturgical occasion or biblical text to the subject of England, the English mission, and English persecution. This is unsurprising, as it was kind of the college's USP, but the point is they were preaching the very mission in which they were engaged. These Englishmen's discourses to the Pope and cardinals on the purpose of the English mission and the nature of martyrdom can therefore be seen as autodidactic performances, much as Alison Schell has argued for the drama produced at English Catholic schools and colleges in exile. So, having introduced the context of English Catholic preaching, I'd just like to discuss some of the sermon texts that I have so far studied. Now let's see if the next slide is going to work for me properly. No. Yeah, here we are. Yeah. Okay. So among the Jesuit archival collections now at Stonyhurst College in Lancashire is a manuscript volume labelled Petri Wright S.J. Conciones. It contains the texts of 65 sermons in English, more or less covering Sundays and major feasts for a whole year. Peter Wright was martyred in 1651. He was working in England from 1643 until his death. That is, of course, the years of the civil wars, the overthrow of Charles I and the regicide, and the establishment of a republican government. One sermon in the volume preaches on the Jubilee year of 1650, which offers a more precise date. Wright was chaplain to the Marquess of Winchester from 1646 until 1651, and so that would seem to be the context of these sermons. It might also explain why this nice volume has been preserved, because Wright would have had relative stability and security. As chaplain to Winchester, he would have had relative security and stability until he didn't, because he got arrested and hanged. So anyway, these texts do not come from the first generation of the English mission. This is some decades later. And the civil wars, of course, followed a period when the executions of Catholics, even of priests, more or less ceased, and anti-Catholic laws were not rigorously enforced. The war saw a revival of persecution by the parliamentarians, one of whose gripes against Charles I was his failure to be tough on popery and tough on the causes of popery. 20 priests were executed between 1642 and 1646. And though victory lessened the parliamentarians' ferocity in this regard, Wright himself was a victim of this renewed persecution in 1651. So today I'm just going to look at a couple of the sermons preached by Wright that are in this volume as an example of what 17th century English Catholics might have heard as they attended masses and sermons through the year. So, in his sermon for the 9th Sunday after Pentecost, Wright preached on Jesus throwing out the money changers from the temple with the words, "My house is a house of prayer." This gospel reading, Luke chapter 19, 41 to 46, included both Christ's entry into Jerusalem and his purging of the temple. It was the same which Campion had preached on 70 years before, but Wright here focuses on the second half of the text. Counterintuitively, it might seem, a large part of the sermon is on the importance of church buildings. The preacher defends the concept of holy places against quote, Anabaptists, Brownists, and other sectaries who, quote, teach that stables, barns, or worse places are as fit to praise God in as our churches. While God is everywhere, and we may in all places pray unto him, still, he says, our blessed Saviour saith that the church which he calls his house is the proper place of prayer. The sermon also defends the adornment of churches against Protestant suspicion of such things. If the temple was to be honoured, churches are even more so, since, quote, in that temple was kept manna, in our churches is kept the heavenly manna, the bread of angels. That is the Blessed Sacrament, the Eucharistic host. Wright also castigates people who he says would rather spend their time in houses of dancing, dicing, or such like temper than in houses of devotion. Only then does he acknowledge the peculiar situation of English Catholics. Churches we may not build, chapels we cannot erect, oratories are not suffered. Places where the Blessed Sacrament was kept reserved must have been rare or non-existent in England. However, said Wright, even in this sad condition, God should be honoured in material ways. Quote, let not our linen be fine, and that of the altar coarse and contemptible, our clothes warm and whole, and those which belong to God's service ragged and worn out. The proper care of temporary hidden altars can stand in for the stately churches, which Wright mentioned earlier, which he said demonstrate the zeal of our forefathers, but are now mere ruins. So he's emphasizing that there's sort of the hidden altars and the vestments which Catholics use to worship can be a sort of care of those, the provision of high quality vestments and so on can stand in for adorning the churches which we no longer have. And after this, the sermon turns to its second part, what he calls the true temples of our Lord. These are neither the churches which are dedicated to his service, nor the great universe which he fills with his glory are his true temples, only our souls made according to his own image. Original sin and the fall of man are then likened to the devil destroying the temple. Baptism through Christ's blood is the temple's rebuilding. When we sin, we profane the temple and must cleanse it, he says, through prayer and penance and contrition. Thus, Wright's sermon does four things. He refutes some Protestant doctrines on disputed points. You might say he refutes certain types of Protestant then in political ascendancy. High Church Anglicans might in fact have found much to sympathise with in Wright's defence of ecclesiastical decoration. Then Wright asserts a kind of Catholic normality. Churches should be beautiful, they are the dwelling place of the Eucharist, and we should often visit them. Then, and only then, he acknowledges the peculiar English condition and suggests how to mitigate it. Finally, he unites English Catholics with all others as parts of that great temple or universal Catholic Church in a spiritual interpretation in which devotion, the sacraments, and virtue create and beautify the true temples. Another sermon in the Stonyhurst Peter Wright volume was preached for the feasts of St. Peter and Paul, as noted, key feast for Catholic claims about the nature of the Church and the papacy. In his sermon on the two martyred apostles, the preacher's concern with Peter's significance for church authority is apparent. He starts by comparing the order and hierarchy of Old Testament worship to the new order of Petrine supremacy. Peter's primacy among the apostles is likened to the divine choice of Aaron for the Israelite priesthood. He then moves on to discuss first the necessity of the church having, quote, one supreme pastor that might in a monarchical way govern and direct the same, and secondly, that St. Peter and his successors are these vicars or pastors. The preacher argues that since just and due order characterize the temple and order brings perfection and beauty in nature, therefore it follows that Christ would provide that order should also govern the church. Indeed, the absence of order in favour of, quote, this private spirit, this self-reflecting judgment, has produced the current chaos in this kingdom. Wright uses Christ's tu es Petrus declaration from Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. But he also used other texts to make his point. differentiating between, for example, differentiating between promises made to all the apostles, such as the spirit of truth shall teach you all truth, John 16, and those made to St. Peter alone, e.g. confirm thy brethren from Luke 22. Wright also cites early Christian authors and church councils in support of his Catholic interpretations of Scripture. Augustine, Origen, and Ambrose are mentioned during this sermon, as well as St. Leo the Great and the Council of Chalcedon in support of Peter's primacy, continuing in his successors. And then he carries on. If none succeeded St. Peter, the whole state of the church is altered from a monarchy to an aristocracy. Who can conceive that it's fallen to a new imperfect form of government? Multiple changes of government at length ruined the commonwealth of the Romans, says Wright. Christ would not subject his church to such chops and changes, to be governed first by one, then by many, one while the bishops, then by kings and princes, here by women, there by children, then by I know not whom, as it is now and hath been of late in England. Note how confusion in ecclesial and in political governance are merged. It's not clear whether Wright is criticising the constitutional confusion which exploded with the civil wars or ecclesiastical disorder, but one gets an impression that they are mutually causative. Also, Wright does not exactly offer an opinion on the current government of England, but a general assumption in favour of monarchy is evident. Finally, Wright emphasises the practical point of the Petrine succession, that the church under that primacy is guaranteed not to teach error in its doctrines. Matthew 16:18 is again cited, that the second half, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it, along with other verses. The end point for his listeners is that it is a singular comfort to Catholics to sail in this ship of St. Peter, cutting through the tempestuous billows of this world to the haven of eternal repose, and therefore, and this is the instruction, let us never recede in the least tittle from its doctrine. So we have this combination of the scriptural proof, the patristic proof, these kind of not quite committing himself, but obviously very topical allusions. And then we get to the kind of pragmatic point, which for his hearers, which is, this is the theory. The consequence is that we have to remain absolutely faithful, and we should never, be tempted to depart even slightly from the doctrine of the Roman Church. Now, just to bring in briefly another manuscript, just to compare Wright's sermon on St. Peter and Paul with another on the same topic, which seems to be from earlier in the 17th century. Now, this is recorded in an anonymous volume, now at the Folger Shakespeare Library, of what seem to be Catholic sermon notes. There's not like a kind of designation, but that's what they seem to be. Now, it begins by citing the same foundational tues Petrus scriptural text, but also quoted is the Council of Ephesus and its attribution of Peter as vicegerent of Almighty God, porter of heaven's kingdom, minister and disperser of divine mysteries, rock of our faith and successor of Moses. So like Wright, he's appealing to the Old Testament precedent. The preacher then recounts the gospel passage of Matthew 16. And like Wright, his practice is to quote both Latin and English translations. So they'll quote the Latin, they'll say English thus, and give you a translation. This sermon acknowledges the adversaries who, he says, demand of us, how doth Christ here make a promise of the keys to Peter, when as he doth afterwards promise them to all the apostles? To all the apostles. He argues that the use of the keys of power and ecclesiastical jurisdiction is distinct from their propriety. And as to their use, it is promised that all the apostles had their keys given them, but as to the propriety and dominion, it is asserted to reside only in Peter. Tibi and not vobis. So he's distinguishing the you singular and the you plural. Dabo clavis regni caelorum. To you I will give the keys of the kingdom of heaven. The Catholic preacher then ridicules the strange absurdity of some Protestants claiming that thou art Peter could be addressed to Peter, but the middle word of that sentence, super hanc Petrus, etc., should be applied to Christ. Within an emphatically scriptural and patristic frame of reference, this sermon provides its listeners with a theological rationale for the necessity of the papacy. It is also inescapable that while this sermon never mentioned claims about the Pope's deposing power over monarchs or allegiance to excommunicated rulers, preaching it would have been a capital breach of multiple acts of Parliament. So the final text I'd like to look at is the volume of Latin sermons at the English College in Rome. Among the 96 separate items, we got that right. Among the 96 separate items are 40 sermons for the Feast of St. Stephen preached by English college scholars before the Pope, and these are dated from 1581 to 1643. The first St. Stephen's sermon was preached before Pope Gregory XIII, who had reigned as Bishop of Rome, Vicar of Christ, and Prince of the Papal States since 1572. He had founded the English College in 1579, one manifestation of his commitment to the Tridentine papacy's emphasis on its universal office, presented as encompassing the duty to evangelize all non-Catholic and non-Christian peoples and the right to authority over all members of the Church. Gregory had founded or patronized other national colleges, mainly in Rome, to train priests for heretic, schismatic, or Islamic-controlled lands. So John Cornelius's St. Stephen's sermon was preached on the Feast of St. Stephen, the first Christian martyr, and he's preaching on the 26th of December, 1581. Less than 4 weeks before, the English College's first scholar, Ralph Sherwin, had become its proto-martyr, executed with Alexander Bryant and Edmund Campion on the 1st of December at Tyburn. 8 weeks earlier, on the 1st of November, a scholar from the German college had preached for the Feast of All Saints to the Pope. On Good Friday, the Pope's preacher would be a member of the Society of Jesus. On the first Sunday of Lent, a Dominican. Other dates were allocated to other religious orders as recorded in the journals of the Papal Masters of Ceremonies. The papal preaching calendar exhibited an international church, diverse in its charisms, yet converging on a focal point of unity in Rome. It also acknowledged the reality of rivalry. Different nations and orders had to be given opportunities to compete for patronage and prestige. So sermons preached before the Pope were obviously part of the Europe-wide tradition of court sermons. They also, however, addressed a spiritual superior. Preachers did not come as representatives of the Church, asking the secular power to remember its duty. While recommending virtue to power might still be important, preachers to the Pope equally came as spiritual sons to a paternal authority, seeking approval and benediction. This had similarities as well as differences with Elizabethan and Jacobean sermons, which addressed the supreme governor of church as well as kingdom. Court sermons reflect patterns of power and patronage, who had access to the ruler, who controlled that access, to what and whom the ruler was willing to listen. The masters of the sacred palace, in charge of providing preachers, coram papa, had less discretion actually than their English counterparts, selecting only 8 out of 19 such preachers each year. The others were determined by the rota mentioned above. The Stephen sermons were delivered in the papal chapel before the Pope, cardinals, ambassadors to the Holy See, and other church hierarchs. The highly formal ritual, seating plans, and physical setting were designed to express the order and hierarchy of the institutional church as a reflection of the celestial one, a divinely inspired order, which the preacher was expected to participate in and promote. In practice, this involved detailed ceremonial instructions, when and where to enter, when to genuflect, which way to look, all of which are copied into the English College Manuscript, twice actually in 2 different places. Now, the papal chapel, in its location, usually means the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican or the papal chapel on the Quirinal, if the Pope was resident there. Now, obviously, there are many things one could draw out of this sermon series. Today, I'm going to look at how 2 of the earlier St. Stephen sermons, those given by John Cornelius in 1581 and William Baldwin in 1586, sought to situate England in a global church. And here are some of the relevant quotations. Okay. The English College Rome embodied both the continuity and discontinuity of England as imagined by Catholics. A hospice with a long medieval history, founded to accommodate English pilgrims to the Holy See, dedicated to St. Thomas of Canterbury and enjoying royal English patronage, was transformed in 1579 to the English College, a seminary for training priests. Like other national colleges, the English College was a symbol both of the supranational character of the Catholic Church and of national particularism. Through its preaching, how the college presented and exploited its Catholic, Roman, and English identity can be explored. But English preachers in Rome need to situate England within a Catholic perception of Europe and the world. This sometimes involved emphasizing the peculiarity of English circumstances. So Cornelius in 1581 appealed for St. Stephen's aid. The Latin quote is on the PowerPoint. I'm going to give you my translation. Since out of all kingdoms and provinces, England alone, evidently so that the race of martyrs propagated through you should not be lacking to the church in this age, rages with tyrannical cruelty against true Christian brothers, and in particular desires and thirsts ardently for the blood of the scholars of the Supreme Pontiff. Cornelius claims special status for English missionaries as the protomartyrs' contemporary representatives. England's persecution of true Christian brothers is unique. Simultaneously, he links them to the larger church, diachronically by making them Stephen's spiritual descendants, and geographically by emphasizing that they are sons of Rome. In 1589, the St. Stephen's preacher Caesar Clement, after discussing the wickedness of Stephen's killers, continued, "Would that nowhere today the church suffered more ferocious enemies of truth than those who attacked Stephen. The Jews condemned an innocent man by false witnesses, but neither did they torment with the rack, nor drag him with horses, nor did they rage against the dead. And today there are not lacking heretics who rend Catholic men, living and dead, asunder, with all mockeries and torments. Recent witnesses to this are the Calvinist frenzies in France, which there continuously, in torturing Catholics, especially priests, reach as far as the savagery of wild and iron-hard men can advance. Innumerable massacres are witnesses and many thousand murders, what tragic things the dogmas of Luther have brought to the peoples of Germany." So Clement emphasizes England's persecution as one manifestation of the bloodshed caused by heresy. Clement presents a vision of Christendom similar to that of the Anglo-Dutch Richard Verstegen's Theatrum Crudelitatis Hereticorum Nostri Temporis, a series of annotated engravings juxtaposing persecuted English Catholics with persecuted Catholics in France and the Netherlands. And yes, obviously, Protestants told very different stories about what happened in those countries, but Catholics were very aware that they had their martyrs too. William Baldwin's 1586 sermon played on both singularity and integration as he addressed Pope Sixtus V. "You, most blessed Father, in this most plentiful flock of the world's Christians, which with such love the Lord committed to you in St. Peter, since you have other sheep in the delightful fields of the church, either fertile with offspring or safe away from the most dangerous wolves, this we reckon most gracious and honourable to us, if we are counted among the sheep preserved for the slaughter." The metaphor asserts English Catholics' place within the unified church, while simultaneously separating them with an allusion to martyrdom. So basically, contextualizing the English experience enabled preachers to play to the early modern papacy's global agenda and universalist ideas of Catholic renewal, while promoting English Catholics' special claims to sanctity and to support. A similar strategy, and so, in this, the sermons are typical in a way of English Catholic propaganda, if you like, as seen, for example, in a printed publication from the English College called De Persecutione Anglicana Commentariolis. Now, the main text, the English title would be An Epistle of the Persecution, was written by the Jesuit Robert Persons, more about him later, and intended for international dissemination. It was published first in Latin and then in English, French, and Italian. The epistle details the laws in force against English Catholics at the time. It recounts stories of Catholics imprisoned or otherwise victimized by the English authorities and describes some martyrdoms which occurred 1578 to 82. Equally important to the Latin version, however, is the appended material. This includes a series of verses, one of which is dedicated to Pope Gregory XIII, addressed as Holy Father, greatest hope of our fatherland, true heir and successor of Gregory the Great. Gregory's generosity is described as embracing the English as well as Germany, Flanders, Cyprus, and other places oppressed by heretics or Turks. England's plight is fitted into a global Catholic struggle against the Protestant crisis and the Islamic threat. English college sermons, similarly, were addressed not only to the Pope, but to the cardinals, with their variegated national and political sympathies, and to the ambassadors of Catholic states, variously entangled in religio-political struggles. So they participated in presenting England and the fate of its Catholics as a battle that mattered in the war for Christendom's soul. Now, by way of comparison, in a way, to the St. Stephen's sermons, I will finish by looking at another sermon from the same manuscript, preached in a rather different context. And this is the funeral oration for Robert Parsons of the Society of Jesus in 1610. Parsons had been the rector of the English College, Rome, until his death. And the preacher of this sermon, Henry Walker, was a scholar of the college. Robert Parsons, by the time he died, was possibly the single most famous and notorious English Catholic. He was hated by English Protestants, naturally, but he also had enemies within his own confession. To his enemies, Parsons was responsible for endless troubles by tying the welfare of English Catholicism to the ambitions of the Crown of Spain. He had, by the mid-1580s, disavowed Elizabeth I as ruler and was actively involved in schemes for her overthrow by any means necessary, usually involving Spanish ships and guns. In the 1590s, he switched his hopes towards the possibility of a Catholic successor to Elizabeth and annoyed a lot of people by helping to author and to promote the Conference of the Next Succession. This book was provocative in its assumption that the royal succession was a matter for some sort of election by the kingdom, which might balance varying factors in its deliberations, but also provocative because it seemed to favour the claims of the Spanish Infanta Isabella, who did indeed have a hereditary claim from some generations back. Faced with the succession of James VI in 1603, Parsons accepted reality and professed his loyalty to King James I. There is indeed no evidence that he ever attempted, endorsed, or encouraged overthrowing James, but he fiercely opposed the oath of allegiance in 1606 on the grounds that it went beyond civil allegiance to trespass on religious ground over which the crown should not have jurisdiction. Whether it did was and is debated. To Parsons' friends, however, he was the tireless servant of God's cause in England. He had worked on the mission in England from 1580 to 81, experiencing its dangers, although surviving them. He had written and printed books in defence of the faith and to publicise to Christendom the persecution of English Catholics. He had founded multiple seminaries and schools for the Catholic education of English boys and young men and to provide priests for England. For the last 13 years of his life, he had been rector of the English College at Rome, ending a period of internal strife and governing it successfully. But on no assessment was this a dull life. Unsurprisingly, the funeral oration accentuates the positive and eliminates the negative. If one is familiar with Parsons' life and times, one can play spot the absent controversy throughout this whole eulogy, which I'm not going to do because it gets boring. The preacher early, but I'm going to give some examples of how Parsons is presented by this preacher. So the preacher early paid tribute to Parsons' year on the mission, praising his courage and refusal to be deterred by threats of torture and death. He, with two fellows, proclaimed a war, one bloodless, it is true, but inflamed with charity, on the heretical republic. He threw himself wholly into pouring out prayers, preaching to move men's souls, receiving confessions to expiate sins, into offering sacrifice to God. Now, the metaphor of war is daring. Certainly there is no evidence that Parsons was involved in military or political schemes during his time in England, but the rest of his life, different story. The preacher also emphasised that Parsons invested himself in writing, publishing, circulating books to allay rumours, disprove calumnies, dissolve accusations. This refers not only to his writing in defence of the mission, but his setting up the first secret Catholic printing press in England itself. In particular, Parsons' intervention on, quote, the question of going to the heretics' profane conventicles is commended. His reply to what this refers to is his reply to Alban Langdale's book defending going to Protestant churches because the law requires it. And according to the preacher, Parsons so destroyed this book that for 20 years following, hardly any memory of it was discovered. To Parsons is attributed the establishment of recusant Catholicism, which if he had not done, the church, which now one way and another we have preserved, radiant with the blood of martyrs, the faith of confessors, by this day, today, we would hardly have at all. This rather underplays the debate on outward conformity, which grumbled and sometimes raged throughout the 1580s and 90s. And it is some exaggeration to say that none of the Catholics of England was polluted by the detestable rite. Occasional conformity was certainly still practiced. But it is probably true that by 1610, no Catholic was defending the practice in theory. And it is certainly arguable that without recusancy, no recognisable Catholic community would have lasted in England. So there is not time here to analyse the rest of this funeral oration in detail. The preacher continues to commend Parsons' educational and missionary activities, avoiding acknowledgement of his alleged iniquities. But it is noticeable in this oration given by one of his students how little Parsons appears as a Jesuit. His membership of the order is acknowledged, but throughout it is his defence of English Catholicism, his founding of English schools and seminaries, his concern, even during his last illness, for the college and his students, that is emphasised. Parsons' tireless generosity makes his death sadder to us, far more unhappy to the fatherland. Perhaps this has something to do with the tension in the college's mission being English, but its governance belonging to the Roman province of the Jesuits, and Parsons was in fact the first English rector the society had provided. Walker therefore emphasises not the Jesuit vocation of his subject, but his Englishness. He may have been noster, one of ours, to the Society of Jesus, but the English college preacher wished to insist that he was also one of ours, the English. So this has been, in a way, a preliminary excursion into the field of English Catholic preaching. What I think I can draw from it as a basis for future work is that this is preaching that is plugged into the wider world of Catholic reform. Its preachers were trained in that milieu, shared its aspirations, and they sought to draw their English hearers into it as well, deliberately addressing them as Counter-Reformation Catholics, as well as English recusants struggling for survival in a Protestant state. At the same time, they exploited English particularity. For Roman audiences, they sought to show England as part of a global church, but at the same time, a distinctive part of it. The traces we can pick up show that, even in the suboptimal circumstances of England, preaching the word was an indispensable part of the early modern project of Catholic renewal. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Lucy. If you wouldn't mind stopping sharing your...
Yeah, I'll stop my screenshot.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so then I can see. Oh, we've got lots of questions here. Oh, and the hands all disappear. Did someone have a question to start us off here? Thanks so much for your fascinating talk. I certainly, after reading hundreds of sermons railing against Catholics, it was interesting to hear the other side. Looks like we have Randy Blacketer with a question. You can unmute yourself and go ahead. Randy? Oh, there we go.
Hi, I actually didn't have a question. I don't know what happened.
Oh, okay.
I'm listening. I'm fascinated. I'm a Reformation historian. I don't know why it said I had a question, but I'm
Okay,
just
your hand was
listening. Okay.
It looks like, Mary, do you have a question?
Hi, yes, thank you. I think the clap hands icon and the raise hands icon look a bit similar.
Oh, look the same.
So
okay.
I think we were all giving Lucy a round of applause in a very socially distanced kind of way.
Okay.
But I do have a question really, which is about the circulation of these sermons. as well as the collections that we have that were probably possibly for the preacher. Is there any evidence that notes of sermons or texts of sermons might circulate as aids to devotion or in other formats, or is there kind of versions of the same material that gets transposed into other genres for circulation?
Yeah, so I don't really know yet. I mean, when you have like an anonymous volume that seems to be notes for sermons, that's not really clear at all whether those are the preacher's notes or someone taking notes on sermons that they've heard. The volume of Peter Wright's sermons is like, it's in Jesuit hands now. It's claimed to be autographed, but at least 2 people who I've shown it to have said that they think the hand looks a bit later than that. So if it's not autographed, then again, we don't know whether that was whether that's been transmitted through people listening rather than through the preacher. So it's not always clear, basically, even when you have. And the other problem, of course, with Catholic sermons is that like this is all incriminating stuff. So people are like cautious about writing it down. Yeah, it's difficult to like say like these are notes from a Catholic sermon I went to without directly implicating yourself in a criminal event.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? Oh, Carolyn Williams has a question.
Yes, I just have more an observation. I don't know how far theory and research is going in this direction, but I've always been a scholar of masculinity, and it strikes me that what's coming out of what I saw today in these sermons is a sense that everybody is very embattled, that they've got to be very brave, that they're being asked to face their own possibly painful physical destruction. And it reminded me of some remarks I've seen recorded, like, for example, by George Abbot, who was a Church of England Archbishop of Canterbury, who, when he was running head to head with the King of England on the possible subject of a divorce, which he was very against, and the king was supporting, in his sort of private notes, he's writing down, things saying, this could lead me to martyrdom. Have I got the guts for it? And in the book, Fires of Faith, about martyrs, you find stories of people assessing each other's courage and capacity for martyrdom. So I just think that this again is emphasizing the importance of sheer physical courage among priests of both faiths, at a time when priests were sometimes regarded as a bit effeminate. And yet,
yeah, that's actually a really helpful observation, and I think it's true. Perhaps possibly perhaps a sense that priests were kind of regarded as a bit effeminate, men in dresses, a bit namby-pamby. They don't go to war, do they? They sign up for this kind of clerisy. And that might partly explain the there's a lot of military metaphor, and there's a lot of language of physical endurance and physical courage, as you say. And there is also this talk about fatherhood and sonship. Those are very masculine, emphatically masculine relationships. So in the English college sermons, this thing of the Pope as father, and these are the sons, his sons. And I think insofar as these things are autodidactic, then in a sense, when these sermons are composed and preached, then they are the preacher is, in one sense, he's showcasing the courage of of English priests to his audience of cardinals. He's also exhorting his fellow students, and he's exhorting himself. Yeah. So I think thinking about this as a kind of insertion of, I don't know, Christian masculinity, if you like, is quite helpful.
I mean, these were men in skirts, but they were on the front line.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and perhaps again that's something they're emphasizing to their Italian audience, that things are very different in England. The joining the church is not the soft option for the spare son, in England.
Yeah. And yet, of course, it couldn't be any old spare son, because if there was anything wrong with you physically, you couldn't be a priest. So the body had to be a masculine body.
Yes, that is one of the things at the time, that the canon law sort of forbade the maimed or physically deformed from entering the priesthood. Yeah.
I think Alison Schall has a question.
Yes, I do. But first, thank you very much, Lucy, for such an elegant and incisive talk. Congratulations. I was thinking about the visibility or otherwise of the sermon in anti-Catholic propaganda. Obviously, the fatal Vesper, the occasion you referred to when Robert Drury is preaching, and there was this calamitous collapse of where he was preaching. That tells us not just what the English who weren't Catholics thought about Catholics, but also gives you a lot of gen on how these sermons actually took place. That strikes me as a bit of an anomaly. I don't get the sense that there is all that much information about Catholic sermons, or factual information anyway, to be gained from non-Catholic printed sources that are hostile to Catholics. But am I wrong?
Well, after we get funding for this research project, I've done the research, I'll tell you. But yeah, it's true that you don't. It's true, actually. One of the Catholic preaching isn't one of the things that they go on and on about, is it?
No.
It's almost as though they don't really acknowledge that Catholics preach, because it isn't one of the kind of dichotomies supposed to be, Protestants preach the word and Catholics go in for, rites and ceremonies. And of course the Protestant ideologues are outraged that these sermons are happening, in the French ambassador's residence. It's one of the things that hugely annoys them about the relatively tolerant atmosphere of, later in James's reign. And obviously, 1623, he's already started making noises about the French match. And of course, the first thing that happens is that Jesuits start preaching to English Catholics in the French ambassador's house. So I'm not sure. I think in some way this Drury having the opportunity to hold these sermons was probably quite anomalous. But I also wonder whether, like Catholic preaching in general, we don't know a lot about Protestant comment on Catholic preaching because we haven't looked yet. So, we might find more.
Yeah, thank you.
It looks like Angela Andriani, I've probably slaughtered that, has a question.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you very much for the terrific talk. That was really interesting. I was wondering about languages. I seem to have understood that sermons in England, well, those that you found in England were in English, and those that you found at the Venerable College were in Latin.
Yeah.
Yes. Have you found so only these two languages and only English in English context? And have you found any instances of a mixture of the two languages in any of the sermons you've seen?
Okay, so far I've only found Latin and English. by English preachers. So far it is English in England and Latin in Rome. I haven't found any that seem to mix the two languages, except that the English sermons always quote the Latin scripture and then quote the translation. So that's what they do. I know there are other sermon manuscripts. For example, some preached at English convents in Flanders. I think those are English language as well, but I haven't been able to look at those yet.
Thank you.
Paul Strauss is next.
Hi, thank you for the very interesting presentation. I'm curious about the writing of the sermons themselves. It looked like the quotes you had are fully written out. Are most of the sermon manuscripts written that way, or are there a lot of abbreviations, outlines? What do they look like more?
So the English College manuscript volume, these are all, apart from the odd one where the text is just missing, for unclear reasons, and these are all complete texts. They're not notes. They use standard abbreviations in Latin, but they're all basically written out in full. So my educated guess is that these are transcribed possibly after the event. They would have been, a copy would have been given to the master of ceremonies before the event. And then the preacher would have had a copy, and then this copy's been made in this manuscript volume, which is, it's not got as many hands as there are items, but there's definitely several hands in it. So I think this volume is being continuously kept by the college as an institution, and they're adding things to it over a period of about 60 years. Yeah, but these are not the drafts. These are not the autographed drafts by the preacher. These are a copy of the finished script. And the other ones, the Peter Wright volume similarly, so full-on draft, and the other one that I talked about, that seems to be notes. But as I said, I don't know whether it's notes from the preacher before the event or notes from a listener after the event.
Are there other questions? Well, people are thinking, I have a question. I'm curious about the reports of Protestants attending these sermons. I don't know if you know anything about this. I mean, it's interesting that, the priests were claiming that they had converted these people who were coming, and that there was some regulation of who was allowed in. And I don't know if you want to say anything more about that.
Well, it is quite an interesting, in a way, it's a great little anecdote which tells you a lot more than it seems to, just about how a clandestine mission actually survives, and even, makes a few converts, because this is all a capital crime. That harboring a priest is a capital crime. And what's more, even these Protestants who agree, say, well, if you let me come to the sermon, I won't dob anyone in. They've kind of committed a felony as well by saying that. So, that's the legal background. But at the same time, apparently, you can have Protestants who are kind of, open to conversion, and they can talk to their Catholic friends and say, oh, well, I'd really like to talk to a priest, and, that can be okay. And it's clear that they've gone and asked the priest, so they won't just bring their friend, on their own initiative. They've asked him. I don't know what there's been some sort of conversation. It's like, well, how much do you trust this person? But yeah, apparently, if you trust them enough, and you will take somebody's word, you will just take someone's word of honor. Well, I'd never do, he's not a Catholic at this point, but he's like, well, I would never do something as low as turn someone in, So there's a sense of I don't know, honor between friends, honor between neighbors, that actually can sort of transcend what everyone knows as the law and all of this confessional enmity. And well, that's how prohibited groups like this actually survives, isn't it? Anyway, and on this occasion, these people are coming clearly because they're interested. They're obviously interested in the debate, and and Stanley, both of these convert. So again, they're not just any Protestant. You know, they're Protestants who you have reason to think might be open to Catholicism. So and how often is this happening? I'm not sure. I mean, like, I've read a few conversion narratives. I don't think I can't think of any others right now that actually depend on a sermon. So this may have been quite rare. But it could happen.
It is very intriguing. And also, do you think there'd be any, I think you mentioned some sermons that were preached maybe at an ambassador's. Did you come across any that were preached in an ambassador's residence?
Yeah.
Would
So
there-
the sermon where there was the terrible accident and the floor collapsed,
Right, yes,
that was
There
in the
might
French
have-
ambassador's house.
yeah. Would there have been less danger in attending one of those because it's sort of outside of the regular jurisdiction
Yeah,
of,
they can't raid the French ambassador's house.
yeah.
He's got diplomatic immunity. On the other hand, sometimes when people got, you know, sort of when they were protests about this sort of thing, sometimes they would arrest people leaving. So there are reports of, like, well, they arrested like 100 Catholics leaving, you know, the French ambassador's house. But of course, it's very difficult to prove what they were doing inside. You know, if they say, we were just passing the time of day, you know. So yeah, they can arrest you leaving. They can arrest you trying to go there, but no, they can't raid the French ambassador's residence. I mean, I suspect that sort of stuff was just pragmatically limited because the ambassadors know that if they go too far, there's going to be a diplomatic incident, and, you know, so they can't take the mick, basically, but they can do a certain amount, you know. And in fact, isn't this a great way for the French ambassador to test the relations between England and France? Like, so how many Catholic sermons can I host before, you know, before I get called to an unpleasant audience with the king, you know?
Are there other questions for Lucy? Yes, Mary?
It's me again. There's been something tugging at my memory, and it's Theophilus Higgins, a Jacobean priest who converted very briefly to Catholicism, joined the Jesuits, and then reverted to Protestantism and preached a 4-hour-long recantation sermon at Paul's Cross. An interesting individual in all sorts of ways. But one of the things he says in his retraction is that not only had he converted to Catholicism, and not only had he joined the Jesuits, but that he had preached before the Pope. I think Michael Questius thinks this probably wasn't a sermon at all, that this was probably some kind of declaration of during Protestantism. But Higgins clearly thought it was worth bigging this up as a sign of how far gone he had been before the light struck and he converted. And I'm just wondering how far reports of preaching in Rome made their way back to England or to English Catholic houses. How significant was the link there? Did people look to get copies of sermons that had been preached in Rome, or did news travel that somebody had preached before the Pope? Was it a big thing, the way Higgins suggests it is?
So I think people were aware that English scholars were preaching before the Pope regularly. I don't know how aware they were of the whole context of you know, this is the St. Stephen's Day sermon, this is their gig, you know, other colleges have have other dates and so on. So I don't know how aware they were of the whole setup. But yeah, I think there was an awareness that this sometimes happened. So, you know, it's Higgins knows it's a claim he can make, you know. Annoyingly, I have not found actual copies of any of these sermon texts in Rome anywhere else, which isn't to say they don't exist. So yeah, you come across anything that looks like a St. Stephen's sermon preached before the Pope by an English Catholic, let me know.
But it does suggest that they were kind of kept they were
Yes.
preserved in England.
Oh yeah,
They
well, this is
may
the
have-
thing that puzzles me. They must have been preserved for a reason. I can't find any record of them being printed either, or I haven't yet. So yeah.
Thank you.
Are there more questions or comments for Lucy? Is there anything that you wanted to expand on that you didn't have time to talk about, or do you want to tell us more about your proposed project?
Well, our proposed project is just to do a proper study of English Catholic preaching, and to you know, its practice and its texts. That we know there are, and I think it could be fascinating. I mean, I think you can see just with that, for example, that Peter Wright sermon on St. Peter. It's interesting to think about the theological depth that they go into, and what does that mean for their hearers? Well, who are their hearers? You know, for starters, it's interesting the way someone like Peter Wright is kind of not exactly being politically topical, but he sort of is. You know, so that's interesting, and also interesting in the ways that so in some ways the sermons aren't nearly as targeted to English Catholics as you might think. Like, why would you go on for pages and pages about how important it is to decorate your churches, you know, to a bunch of recusants who don't go to church, you know? So I think that's interesting, and like why they work the way they do. So I think what a proper study of this could tell us is how English Catholics are integrated into the wider Catholic Reformation. And of course we know that they're face to face with Protestant culture, but I don't think we only want to look at English Catholic sermons as in relation to English Protestant sermons, although you know, that's obviously of interest. And we know also that the thing that I haven't touched on because I haven't been able to look at the text yet, but we know there was preaching in these English convents. So, you know, convents of English women and men that were set up in exile. And I wonder how that would differ, you know, both from the English scene and from, you know, sermons preached in these English colleges, which are so focused on training priests. Yeah, and they're all questions, but I think Alison and I are trying to persuade someone to give us lots of money for this research, which would tie into tie into kind of a bigger project that Alison's got in mind on sort of recusant culture as a kind of European phenomenon, something like that.
How far would you want? Sorry, go ahead. You can go.
I was just wondering, is there room for comparison with Ireland? I mean, particularly if you go into the 1650s, the politics of preaching gets quite interesting.
I think, yeah, comparison with Ireland would be actually quite fascinating because I don't think we do nearly enough of that, actually, comparing English and Irish Catholicism, because in Ireland you've got this mirror image situation where Catholicism is like prohibited, but it's also the majority religion, and that just makes things both much more difficult and much easier. So yeah, actually that would be something that's really important to do, but I don't know how much I don't know the scholarship on Irish Catholic preaching very well, so
I think language complicates things as well, so
yes,
sources that there are might be in Irish.
How many languages do they preach in Ireland? Do they use the Gaelic as well as the English?
I know the Franciscans preached in Gaelic. I don't know about textual sources. You'd have to ask the Franciscans, but I do know the Franciscans have kind of compiled. They do curate whatever is left, whatever has survived. But I think when the Catholic mission came to Rinuccini, I think there was a sense that Irish Catholicism was already kind of Counter-Reformation Catholicism, that there had been catechizing going on before the mission.
Oh yeah. But
that's going a long way back in my history of Ireland, which I haven't studied since I was 17. So
How far would you go chronologically in the project?
I think, well, it partly depends how much really good material there is. But we might go up as far as the mid 18th century on this one. Yeah, because then we think there might be some really good 18th century material. So but you have to understand that like the 1580 and 1750 are so different, you know. But yeah.
Do you have a sense of what kind of sources, other than like whatever manuscript sermons survive, might give you information about the nature of preaching? You mentioned you're not sure how much there is in sort of the hostile Protestant records of this. Are there things like, do you know if there's any things like diaries or people talking about preaching in letters, which would be a little more dangerous?
The diaries would be rare for the earlier part of the period.
Yeah.
Might be helpful for the much later on, you know, when you get to the turn of the 18th century. There are I mean, I think one thing I do is just go back to like all the usual places, mission reports, martyrological reports, that kind of thing. And you can pick up various references to preaching, you know, just that tell you that it was happening, and then see how much you can work out about exactly what was happening and where. Like, you know, that thing about Stanley, like that's a martyr hagiography. It's his hagiography of Lawrence Humphreys, and a couple of other people. But actually, when you look at it from that angle, you know, this actually tells us something about sermonizing. And you do get these repeated just references in letters from the mission saying, send us more men and make sure they're good preachers. So, you know, it's obviously important. And the other thing is, I did realize as I was finishing compiling the lecture that all of these sources are Jesuits. They're all Jesuit preachers. But I'm not concluding from that only the Jesuits were preaching. I think it's they may have been particularly keen on it because it was just one of the things that they like placed emphasis on. But I'm sure there were non-Jesuits preaching. It's just that as with so many things, the Jesuits are just better at telling you about it.
Susan Cogan mentioned she was wondering about commonplace books too, if there's anything that like that where they might find information about Catholic preaching.
Not that I've found yet, but you know, I keep my eye out for it. And yes, that might be a place where you might find things like that. But as I said, they're not always very identifiable. Like sometimes you'll get a manuscript and it'll sort of have a series of meditations on religious subjects or on religious feasts or whatever, and it's really not clear. You could sort of think, well, are these sermons, are these homiletic, or are they just meditations, you know? And if it doesn't say, you can't really be sure.
Sort of an added layer of complication. You know, we have a hard enough time sometimes figuring out if things are referring to sermons, but then you have the whole other level of it could be dangerous if somebody found something and it's through a sermon. So your task is even more difficult. Are there other? Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just saying, in some way, because in some ways, of course, like copying bits from a Catholic book is less incriminating than you know, than admitting that you've been going to Catholic sermons.
Right. Yeah. Susan said that she thought that she ran across some commonplace books in a recent research trip, and she's going to look through notes and email you if she finds something.
That would be great. That would be great.
Wait, Mary has another question.
It just occurred to me when you said that, is going to a Catholic sermon illegal in the way that attending Mass was?
No, but if you're at a Catholic sermon, then by definition, you know about the priest. Right. So you're, at the least, you're like an accomplice in a felony. Yeah.
Are there any further questions for Lucy? I mean, obviously you have lots of work to do. If somebody will give you money to do it, and there's lots of potential here. I'd love it if you go up into the 18th century, because that's where I work, and the period that I work on. And I was interested in the people attending the sermons, because you find sort of in the 18th century, sometimes people doing a tour of different preaching locations in London, and it includes attending Catholic sermons at
Right.
like ambassadors' residences and things like that. It would have been less dangerous than earlier on. And it doesn't give a lot of details, but it's fascinating.
Yeah.
All right. Well, if there's no more questions for Lucy, we'll wrap things up. Last chance. Anybody? Thank you so much for a fascinating talk today, and giving us for some of us the first kind of glimpse into what Catholic preaching actually looks like, and we also appreciate your work for GEMMS, adding material on Catholics, which we had, I don't know if we had any before you started working on that. So it's great to have that, and to expand our view of what preaching looked like both in England and what English people got up to on the continent as well. So that's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And be sure to keep a lookout for our next lecture, which is by Catherine Evans, who was here briefly but had to leave early. She's going to be talking about poetry, and she just changed her title yesterday. It was poetry and manuscript sermons, and possibly something else I'm forgetting at this moment. But if you keep an eye on the GEMMS social media, you'll see us advertising it there. And thank you so much for coming, and for the fascinating discussion afterwards as well.
Yeah. Thanks. Bye.